It was me. I was the one who signed the order. I, Mayor Richard Foreman, stood there with a grim smile of righteous satisfaction as the excavator sank its steel claw into the facade of Our Lady of Mercy Parish. It wasn't just brick and mortar I was tearing down. It was history, memory, 100 years of faith held in the hearts of this town. I remember the sound, a deep, guttural splintering that seemed to tear the very air. I saw the dust, thick and gray, rise up and choke the morning sun, and in that moment, I told myself the stifled cries of the old women gathered across the square. I told myself that was the sound of angels, rejoicing that a stronghold of deception was finally falling. My war, I insisted to anyone who would listen, and even more fiercely to myself, wasn't with the people of Havenwood, it was with her. With that plaster idol they called the Mother of God, the one they knelt before, the one whose serene painted face I saw as a mask for all the world's spiritual blindness. It was me who, armed with the power of my office and the unquenchable fire of a blind, zealous faith, ordered her house to be torn down, to erase her very memory from our town. My name is Richard Foreman, and I am 62 years old. But this story begins long before that day, long before I was the mayor. It begins in the soil of this town, Havenwood, a fading jewel in the Rust Belt, a place of silent smokestacks and proud, tired brick buildings. I was forged in a fire and brimstone faith, a world painted in stark black and white. There was God, and there was the devil. There was truth, and there was deception. There were no shades of gray, no room for doubt, no space for mystery. My father was a man who believed God was a hammer, and the world was a nail, and it was our job to strike true and hard. I inherited his certainty, his iron will. For me, faith wasn't a comfort, it was a weapon. And I saw a great deception nestled right in the heart of our town square, the Catholic Church, Our Lady of Mercy. It wasn't the building itself that gnawed at me, not really. It was what it represented. It was the statues, the incense, the rosaries, and most of all, it was her. The statue of Mary that stood high above the altar, a constant, silent presence. To my neighbors, she was a symbol of comfort, of a mother's love. To me, she was the ultimate idol, a graven image that stole glory from the Almighty, a plaster lie. This conviction wasn't just a quiet belief. It was the engine of my life. I ran for mayor on a moral cleanup platform, and everyone knew what that meant. I promised to bring Havenwood back to its foundational truths, and my ultimate target was no secret. I remember the arguments around my own dinner table. My wife, Eleanor, a good woman who loved me, would plead with me. "Richard, it's their history. It's their grandmother's church." I would look at her and see only compromise. I didn't know then that she kept her own late mother's rosary hidden away in a jewelry box. A secret act of defiance, or perhaps just a desperate clinging to a memory I was trying to bulldoze. Even my oldest friend, Pastor David, a man from my own church, began to pull away. "Richard," he'd say, his voice laced with a concern that I mistook for weakness, "I'm starting to see more pride than piety in this crusade of yours." I dismissed them all. They were blind. They couldn't see the spiritual rot I was chosen to excise. So I found the tools for my holy war not in scripture but in civic code, a long-forgotten zoning ordinance, a biased structural report I commissioned myself, claiming the old church was a public hazard. It was all a lie, of course, a righteous lie to achieve a greater good. The day of the demolition was the apex of my power, the culmination of my life's purpose. I stood there, document in hand, feeling the cold morning air on my face. The work crew was there, and a small, heartbroken crowd of parishioners. I remember Sister Agnes, a tiny, ancient nun who had tended that parish for 50 years. She didn't shout. She didn't curse me. She just stood there, her hands clasped, her eyes closed, praying. Her silence was more unnerving than any scream. The excavator coughed to life, its engine a low growl that vibrated through the pavement. The first blow to the wall sent a shockwave through the crowd. Then another, and another. Bricks rained down. The stained glass windows, depictions of saints I had long scorned, shattered into a million glittering tears. And then, the steeple began to groan. It tilted, slowly at first, then with a terrifying speed, it came crashing down, and with it, the statue. For a brief, silent moment, I saw her silhouetted against the sky, a white figure in a graceful, helpless arc. Then she hit the ground, and the sound was nothing like the crash of the steeple. It was a sharp, definitive crack, like a bone snapping. She shattered in an instant. A cloud of white dust rose where she had landed, and in that moment I felt it. A cold, hollow triumph. A victory that brought no peace, no joy, only a profound and sudden emptiness. I had won. I had silenced the idol. But as the dust settled, a new silence began to creep over Havenwood, a silence where the church bells used to be. If this story is already touching you in some way, if you feel that pull of a journey just beginning, I ask you to join me on it. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and be sure to hit the notification bell so you don't miss how this story unfolds. It's important for me to know that these words are not being spoken into a void, and I'd truly love to know where this story is reaching. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It would mean the world to me. The weeks that followed the demolition were not filled with the righteous peace I had anticipated. The silence was the first thing that got to me. For 100 years, the bells of Our Lady of Mercy had marked the hours in Havenwood. The gentle chime at noon, the solemn toll for a funeral, the joyful peal on a Sunday morning. It was the town's heartbeat, and I had stopped it. Now, the silence was a presence, a gaping hole in the day. It was a constant, nagging reminder of what I had done. I would wake in the dead of night, my heart pounding, straining to hear a sound that wasn't there anymore. The town itself seemed to hold its breath. The victory I had envisioned, the one where the community would thank me for excising this cancer, never materialized. Instead, a quiet, cold resentment settled over Havenwood, like a winter fog. People I had known my whole life would cross the street to avoid me. The friendly nods were gone, replaced by hard stares. The diner, where I used to hold court over coffee, became a place of whispers and averted gazes. I was the mayor, but I was an outcast in my own town. I had fractured it, and the hate I thought I was destroying was now staring back at me from every corner. Even at home, the silence was different. Eleanor moved around the house like a ghost. The warmth had gone out of her eyes. We didn't fight about it anymore. We didn't talk about it at all. It was just there, a wrecking ball in the middle of our living room. And then there was Sister Agnes. Every single morning, without fail, she would walk to the rubble-strewn lot where her church once stood. She didn't protest. She didn't hold a sign. She would just stand there, her rosary beads slipping through her gnarled fingers, and she would pray. I'd watch her from my office window across the square, this tiny, frail woman. I told myself she was praying for God's judgment to fall on me, but there was no anger in her posture, only a profound and unsettling peace. Her quiet compassion was 1,000 times more unnerving than any curse could have been. My carefully constructed world, my fortress of righteous certainty, began to crumble not from the outside but from within. The true crisis, the event that would bring me to my knees, came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The call was from my son Daniel. His voice was a choked, terrified sound I had never heard before. "Dad, it's Lily. Something's wrong." Lily. My granddaughter, my 7-year-old, bright-eyed, laughing Lily. She was the one pure, uncomplicated joy in my life. She had collapsed at school. A seizure. By the time I reached the hospital, she was unconscious, hooked up to a terrifying web of wires and tubes. The doctors were grim. their language clinical and evasive. Words like neurological event, inflammation, uncertain prognosis hung in the sterile air. They didn't know what it was, but they knew it was bad. My power, my mayoral authority, my iron will, it all meant nothing in that fluorescent-lit corridor. I couldn't sign an order to make her well. I couldn't bulldoze the sickness out of her body. For the first time in my adult life, I was utterly, terrifyingly helpless. The days blurred into a sleepless nightmare of waiting rooms and whispered consultations. I watched my son and his wife crumble, their faces etched with a fear I knew was a mirror of my own. I tried to pray. I opened my Bible, the same one my father had carried, its pages worn and familiar. I spoke the words, the powerful, certain verses that had been my armor for decades, but they were just sounds in the air. They felt hollow, empty. The God of fire and brimstone, the God I had served with such violent conviction, was silent. It was the same deafening silence I had forced upon the town square. There was no comfort, no reassurance, just the cold, hard echo of my own voice in an empty cathedral of fear. The irony was a physical pain in my chest. I, who had prided myself on my direct line to the Almighty, couldn't get an answer. I was alone, truly alone, adrift in a sea of terror, and the anchor of my faith had been cut away. The man who had torn down a house of God now found himself with no place to turn. The pride, the certainty, the righteous fury, it all burned away, leaving only the raw, agonizing fear of a man about to lose everything that mattered. If you're feeling the weight of this moment with me, if this journey is resonating with you, please show your support by liking this video and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss where this path leads next. Your presence here, even silently, means more than you know. It was the third night, or maybe the fourth. Time had dissolved into a sterile soup of antiseptic smells and the rhythmic, terrifying beep of machines that were keeping my granddaughter alive. I sat in a plastic chair outside the ICU, my Bible open on my lap, but the words were just black marks on a page. They were letters, not life. They were the language of a God who had gone silent, a God who felt as distant as a cold star. I looked at my hands, the hands that had signed the demolition order, and I saw them for what they were, instruments of destruction, useless. I couldn't hold Lily's hand. I couldn't smooth her hair. I could only wait. The helplessness was a physical poison, seeping into my bones, leaving me hollowed out and weak. Sometime after midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. The recycled air, the hushed, urgent footsteps of the nurses, the suffocating weight of my own guilt. I had to get out. I walked out of the hospital's automatic doors and into the cold night air. I didn't have a destination. I just walked. My feet, seemingly with a will of their own, carried me through the sleeping streets of Havenwood, past the darkened storefronts and the silent houses, until I found myself standing on the edge of the town square. Standing before the wound I had carved into its heart. The demolition site was a jagged silhouette against the moonlit sky. It was a graveyard, a monument to my own pride. The chain-link fence I'd ordered put up felt like a pathetic attempt to contain the desecration. I found a gap where the fence was loose and slipped through. I stood in the center of the rubble, on the very spot where the altar had been. Twisted rebar poked out of the broken foundation like skeletal fingers. Piles of shattered brick and splintered wood lay in ghostly mounds. The air was thick with the smell of dust and damp earth. This was my kingdom, the kingdom of a king of ruins. I stood there, shivering in the cold, and I felt nothing but a profound, bottomless emptiness. There was no God here. I had made sure of that. I had chased him out with bulldozers and wrecking balls. And now, in my darkest hour, I was standing in the void I had created. And then I saw it. Just a flicker. A sliver of white against the gray dust, catching the moonlight in a way that seemed Impossible. It wasn't a grand light from heaven. It wasn't a booming voice. It was just a small, quiet glint in the dirt. But it pulled me. I stumbled forward, my dress shoes crunching on debris, and I knelt. Not in prayer. I had forgotten how. I knelt like a desperate man searching for a lost key. I started digging with my bare hands, ignoring the sharp edges of plaster and stone that scraped my skin. My fingers, raw and bleeding, finally closed around something smooth and cold. I lifted it from the dirt, my heart pounding in my throat. I brushed away the dust and held it up to the moonlight. It was a hand. A woman's hand, carved from plaster. From the rubble of my victory, I had unearthed this one, perfect fragment of the shattered statue. It was her hand. The fingers were delicate, slender, and they were outstretched, not in a gesture of command or judgment, but in a gentle, open offering. It was a hand ready to receive, or to give. A hand of peace. I stared at it, this piece of plaster I had condemned as an idol, this graven image I had smashed in the name of truth. And in the silent ruin of my own making, I finally saw. I saw the arrogance, the blind, hateful pride that had driven me. I saw the pain I had caused, the history I had erased, the faith I had mocked. It wasn't a statue I had destroyed. It was a symbol of comfort, of mercy, the very things I was now so desperate for. The very thing this hand, lying here in my palm, seemed to be offering me. And that's when it broke. 30 years of iron-willed pride, 30 years of unshed tears. It all came pouring out of me in a ragged, ugly sob that tore through the silence of the night. I clutched that plaster hand to my chest, and I wept. I wept for Lily. I wept for my wife. I wept for the town I had broken. I wept for myself. I wasn't asking for a miracle. I was begging for mercy, for forgiveness. Right there, in the midst of my breakdown, a vibration against my chest. My phone. I fumbled for it, my hands shaking, my vision blurred with tears. The caller ID glowed in the dark. County General Hospital. My blood ran cold. This was it. The call. I answered, my voice a choked whisper. Hello? It was Dr. Evans, but his voice. It wasn't the grave, tired tone I had grown to dread. There was a different quality to it, a note of cautious disbelief. Mr. Foreman, he said, I don't have an explanation for this. You should come back. Lily's fever just broke. Some of the swelling in her brain, it's starting to go down. The words didn't compute at first. I looked from the glowing screen of my phone to the white plaster hand in my other palm. Coincidence? A random medical event? My rational mind screamed it. But my heart, the broken, bleeding thing in my chest, knew better. A gesture of mercy answered. I hadn't been praying to a statue. I had been crying out into the void, and someone had answered. That night, kneeling in the dirt, I didn't become a different man, but the man I was began to die. If you're still with me on this journey, if you feel this shift happening, please let me know by liking the video. And be sure to hit that notification bell, because what happened next, well, that's where the real journey begins. I stumbled back to the hospital in a daze, the cold plaster hand clutched in my pocket, its weight a strange, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of my mind. The old Richard Foreman, the mayor, the man of logic and order, was screaming inside my head. He was shouting about coincidence, about the unpredictable nature of neurological trauma. He was explaining, with cold, hard reason, that Lily's fever would have broken anyway, that the doctors' treatments had finally taken effect, that my emotional breakdown in a pile of rubble had absolutely no connection to the events in that hospital room. He told me I was sleep-deprived, grieving, hallucinating from stress. It was a logical, airtight case. And every single word of it felt like a lie. Because logic couldn't explain the feeling that had washed over me when I held that fragment in my hand. It wasn't just plaster. In that moment, It had been a conduit for something else. A peace that defied understanding. A mercy I had done nothing to deserve. This internal war raged with every step I took. The man I had been for 62 years fought desperately for control, using reason and skepticism as his weapons. But a new broken part of me, the part that had wept in the dirt, just held on to the memory of that moment, that impossible feeling of being heard in the silence. If you've ever felt that kind of battle inside yourself, that war between what your mind can explain and what your heart knows to be true, please let me know with a like. And hit that notification bell, because you need to see where this journey led, how this war was finally resolved. The next few days were a blur. Lily was slowly, miraculously coming back to us. The doctors called it a remarkable recovery. They used words like resilience and best-case scenario. My family saw it as a miracle, a gift from God. And I said nothing. I would sit by her bedside, watching the color return to her cheeks, and I would feel this overwhelming gratitude, immediately followed by a wave of searing, suffocating shame. My past words came back to haunt me like ghosts. I remembered cornering old Mr. Rossi outside the grocery store, mocking the rosary he always carried. Praying to your beads, Frank? You know that's just talking to plastic, right? I remembered a town hall meeting where I'd referred to the statues inside Our Lady of Mercy as graven images and plaster dolls for the spiritually immature. I had said those words, out loud, with pride, with a cruel, self-righteous certainty. And now, hidden in my coat pocket, was my own piece of plaster, a piece of a doll that I had clutched like a drowning man grasping for a lifeline. The hypocrisy was a physical sickness in my gut. Every time I looked at my sleeping granddaughter, I didn't just see her recovery. I saw the face of my own hideous pride. I, who had claimed to speak for God, had been the most blind. I, who had preached against idols, had made an idol of my own righteousness. I couldn't go on like this, torn in two. I had to do something. The rational man in me wanted to throw the plaster hand away, to forget that night, to file it away as a stress-induced anomaly and move on. But I couldn't. It felt like it would be the ultimate act of betrayal. So one afternoon, while Lily was sleeping and Eleanor was with her, I did the unthinkable. I drove to the temporary parish the Catholics had set up in the old Knights of Columbus Hall. I parked a block away, my heart hammering against my ribs. What was I doing? Was I gonna confess? To who? About what? I didn't have the words. I just knew I had to be there. And I knew I had to find her. Sister Agnes. I found her not inside, but outside, tending to a small, makeshift garden of potted plants, lined up against the brick wall. She was humming a quiet tune, her wrinkled hands gently tending to a wilting rose bush. She looked up as my shadow fell over her. Her eyes, clear and calm, showed no surprise, no anger, no judgment. It was as if she had been expecting me. I couldn't speak. The mayor who had commanded press conferences and swayed crowds was struck dumb. The shame was a gag in my throat. I just stood there for a long moment, a pathetic, broken man. Then, slowly, my hand went to my pocket. I pulled out the plaster hand and held it out to her on my open palm. My own hand was trembling. I was trying to give it back, to return what wasn't mine, to undo what I had done. She looked down at the fragment, then back up at my face. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She wiped the dirt from her hands onto her apron and reached out. But she didn't take the plaster hand from me. Instead, she took my hand, the one holding the fragment, and gently folded my own fingers back down over it, closing them into a fist. She held my hand in both of hers for a moment. Her touch was warm, firm. She looked me straight in the eye, and in that gaze, I saw not the condemnation I deserved, but a profound, heartbreaking compassion. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The gesture said everything. It's yours. It was for you. Forgiveness is not something you return. It's something you accept. In that silent moment, standing in the shadow of a rented hall, the great Richard Foreman was finally, utterly, and mercifully demolished. The war was over, and I had lost. Thank God I had lost. Word travels fast in a small town, but the news of my transformation traveled like a wildfire in a dry field. It wasn't the story of a mayor who'd had a change of heart. It was the story of a man who had gone mad. The whispers followed me everywhere. At the diner, I'd hear them from the next booth over. Grief broke him, one would say. He was always wound too tight, another would reply. My old allies, the ones who had cheered on the demolition, were the most vicious. A few deacons from my former church cornered me outside the post office. It wasn't an intervention. It was an inquest. They told me I was deceived, a victim of a clever satanic trick. One of them, a man I'd known for 40 years, put his hand on my shoulder, his face, a mask of pity and condescension. "Richard," he said, "the enemy is most dangerous when he comes disguised as an angel of light. You had a vision, a hallucination brought on by stress. Don't let them win. Don't let her win." I looked at their faces, so full of the same blind certainty that had once owned me, and I felt, not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain the unexplainable. I just looked him in the eye and said, my voice quiet but firm, "It was the most real experience of my life." They shook their heads and walked away, leaving me excommunicated by their judgment. They were right about one thing, though. The old Richard Foreman was gone. He had died in the rubble, clutching a piece of plaster. I found a strange and unexpected refuge in the very place I had tried to annihilate. I started attending the services they held in the Knights of Columbus Hall. The first time I walked in, a hush fell over the room. I was the enemy, the destroyer, sitting in a folding chair in the back row. But no one asked me to leave. Instead, an old woman I recognized from the crowd that day, Mrs. Rossi, came over and simply handed me a printed-out leaflet with the hymns on it. A small, silent gesture of welcome. And so I sat there, and I listened. The things I had once despised as empty ritual began to show me their heart. The smell of incense no longer smelled like paganism. It smelled like prayer rising. The murmur of the rosary wasn't the mindless chanting of idolaters. It was a quiet rhythm of devotion, a lifeline of faith held in the hand. I saw people, my neighbors, find real comfort, real solace, real community in these symbols I had declared meaningless. I looked at the simple, temporary altar they had set up, with a small framed picture of the Virgin Mary, where the grand statue used to be. And I didn't see an idol. I saw a mother. I saw a symbol of the fierce, tender, unconditional mercy that had found me in the dark. I didn't understand it all. I still don't. But I was beginning to learn that faith wasn't about having all the answers. It was about learning to live with the mystery. My true public reckoning came a few months later. The parish had organized a fundraiser in the town square, a Rebuild Our Lady of Mercy festival. Tents were set up, a local band was playing, and the smell of grilled hot dogs filled the air. It was a beautiful, hopeful day, a defiant act of life on the very ground I had desecrated. I was there, helping set up tables, a quiet volunteer. No one had asked me to, I just showed up. Sister Agnes saw me and just nodded, pointing to a stack of chairs. Toward the end of the afternoon, she took to the small stage to thank everyone for coming. And then she did something I never expected. She looked out over the crowd, found my eyes and said, "And I'd like to invite our mayor, Richard Foreman, to say a few words." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to me. My heart seized in my chest. This was it. I walked to that stage, my legs feeling like lead. I stood at the microphone, looking out at the faces of the people I had so profoundly wronged. I took a deep breath. "There was a man," I began, my voice shaking, "who stood on this very spot and felt a cold, hollow triumph as he watched your church fall. He was a man who believed God was a hammer, and he was proud of how hard he could swing it. He was a man so blinded by his own righteousness that he couldn't see the love and the history and the faith he was turning into dust. That man was me." I paused, the silence of the crowd absolute. "I can't stand here and tell you I'm sorry enough. Words can't rebuild what I tore down. But I can stand here and tell you the truth. In my darkest hour, when my own granddaughter's life was hanging by a thread, my God of hammers was silent. My pride was useless. My power was a joke. I came here, to this grave I had dug, and I was the one who was buried. And in that darkness, something reached for me. It was the very thing I had tried to destroy. It was mercy. The mercy you all call Our Lady. The mercy that I now understand is the face of God's own love." Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't wipe them away. I learned that the real idol wasn't made of plaster. The real idol was the throne of hatred I had built in my own heart. What I rejected is what lifted me from the ground. I am asking you today, all of you, for your forgiveness. I stepped back from the microphone, my confession hanging in the air. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, from the front row, old Mr. Rossi, the man whose rosary I had once mocked, began to applaud. Slowly, tentatively at first, and then all at once, the whole town square joined him. It wasn't a hero's ovation. It was a quiet, grace-filled sound of acceptance. My journey isn't about changing my religion. It's about finally finding my faith. It's about the demolition of a man's pride to make way for a humble heart. It's about understanding that God's house is not made of brick and mortar, but of mercy. This journey from hate to humility, from blindness to sight, is the most important story I have to tell. And if it has moved you, if it has made you think about the walls in your own heart, I ask you to please like this video, so that this message of transformation can reach others who may be lost in their own darkness. And hit that notification bell, because stories of grace are the ones we need to hear most. And please, in the comments, I truly want to hear from you. Has mercy ever found you when you least expected it or least deserved it? Your story matters. Your faith matters. Let's fill this space not with arguments, but with testimonies of grace. Thank you for listening.